he turned up in Belgium shortly after the Belgium UFO wave with all of the triangular objects that were being reported over there. And he had a meeting with several of the high officials in Belgium, including the Air Force pods who were responsible for chasing one object one night and tracking it on radar. But strangely, Vallée said D'Amato's perspective on the end was that the objects being seen in Belgium were man-made. Now, that is very interesting. I'd never heard that put forward before by somebody who was a Senate staffer. I've heard it put forward by other people, but here's someone who actually took the time to go to Belgium, met with high officials there, accessed data there, and came back, and still his thought was that the objects were man-made. And so that really threw Jacques Vallée in his diary entry. He said, well, that's what he came back and told me. He also said that D'Amato mentioned that the American Federation of Scientists had a research project going on Belgium-style aircraft, believing that something was being manufactured in the US. So very interesting to have a look at Jacques Vallée's diaries just released to find out information about some of these characters. I don't think we'd find out any of this any other way than if Jacques Vallée didn't take the time to make these notes that we can read 20 years later.
Got it. And yeah, let's move on to another insider from back in the day that you turned up. Apparently, there was at least some ad hoc work going on with an individual named Ron Blackburn. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, I'd come across Ron Blackburn in Jacques Vallée's Volume 3 diaries, where he was talking about the decade 1980 to 89. Towards the end of 1989, a character popped up in Vallée's book called Ron Blackburn. And like many other people, I think, well, never heard of this particular person. Maybe I should try and do some research on it. And in fact, there was very little on the surface on the internet about Blackburn. He turned up at a conference in Las Vegas in 2005 where someone was holding a UFO crash retrieval conference. And the person who wrote up the conference proceedings mentioned that one Dr. Ron Blackburn had turned up, a lieutenant colonel in the US Air Force, and that he had investigated UFOs for the Air Force and for military contractors, unquote. And I thought, well, this is very interesting. I've never heard of anyone who's openly admitted that they were doing this back in that era, in the 1989 time. And just as an aside, I might mention that I was reading at the time a book by journalist Howard Blum, B-L-U-M. And Howard Blum wrote a book saying there'd been a United States Air Force UFO project running in the time frame 1983 to 1985. And that, well, again, was fairly new to me. So I did some more deeper research on the internet, and thank goodness we've got the internet. And what I came across was, yeah, sure enough, there'd been a character who turned up to talk to Jacques Vallée in the mid-1980s. So this was just after Howard Blum's proposed project. And he was talking to Jacques Vallée about his own research. And Blackburn was particularly interested in UFO technology. He was at that time a consulting engineer for advanced systems technology at Lockheed. And a bit of checking does show that Lockheed does recording during that period. And what it says is he spent 21 years in the Air Force, and he then went on to join Lockheed and worked at the famous Skunk Works, where so many people have an interest in UFOs. And what he wanted to actually do, like many of us, he was a very classic UFO researcher. He actually wanted to compute the mass and acceleration for UFOs, working on ground traces, the weight of an object, and get stuck into an engineering approach. So he was a typical engineering approach bod. And what happened then is that I found out by reading John Alexander's book a little bit more about him, that Blackburn had in fact turned up as a co-founder of John Alexander's Advanced Theoretical Projects UFO government get-together, a number of people who are interested in UFOs in the government. And that particular program we've now heard about, we know some more details. But what I wasn't aware is Ron Blackburn actually co-founded it with John Alexander. And so there are a number of people who were involved with Blackburn looking at an engineering approach. And he was particularly interested in microwaves, Blackburn. In fact, he has some patents in that particular area. And he was involved with the Air Force with electromagnetic pulse projects. But what I found out is I actually found an old audio interview with him, which was an excellent source of original information. And in that, he was saying, so this is personally coming from Blackburn, that he was doing UFO investigations as a hobby. So the person who said that he had been investigating on behalf of the Air Force, Blackburn himself actually contradicted that and said, no, it was just a hobby with me. But he said, what I was doing is straight engineering. I was noticing things like there were no reported sonic booms from UFOs. And so Blackburn claimed that he actually reverse engineered a process to mitigate or eliminate sonic booms based on what his research on UFOs had told him. And he actually filed a patent for sonic booms dissipation back in the 1980s, which is way ahead of today's research, where I think last year Lockheed announced that it solved sonic booms and it was preparing an aircraft for production in the next few years, which would fly supersonic without creating a sonic boom. But here was Blackburn saying the same thing in the 1990s. So that was interesting. And he also, in this audio interview, mentioned that he had submitted a patent for a cloaking device, again, based on his observations of UFO reports. And I thought, well, this is something that one of the 38 Defence Intelligence Reference Documents, the DIRDs for short, that we've all seen a list of, one of those is about cloaking. And here's Blackburn in the late 1980s, early 1990s, saying that he reverse engineered a cloaking device concept from UFO sightings and that he applied for a patent. And the patent came back and said, quote, "This idea is not patentable," unquote. It's not patentable, but unclassified because it's foreign export controlled, end of quote. So he said, well, look, 20 years before everybody else, I was working on how to eliminate sonic blooms. I got this idea from UFO reports. I also applied for a patent for a cloaking device based on my research. So here's somebody 30 years ahead of his time. So I thought he was quite an interesting character.
Is it okay if I mention the patent number you're talking about?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, good. That patent number for our listeners to be able to go ahead and do research on. And then I'm also going to refer them to your website so they can look at this wonderful article you've written on regarding sonic booms and the rest of the subject matter you just covered. The patent number is 579-7563. That's 579-7563. And you would go to UFOs-scientificresearch.blogspot.com. And if you look up sonic boom research by Keith, you'll see that. I will also go into the chat section of our talk, and I will go ahead and drop that URL to the article that Keith wrote on this topic and include the patent number as well.
Yeah, we can also drop the page number in there as well.
Yes.
Yeah, where the justia.com. I've just added that.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Keith. Please keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt, Frank.
No, not a problem. Thanks for quoting that. I mean, what I am about, I guess, is I love original documentation. The fact that you can go back and find an original audio from a person from years ago and get their perspective directly, rather than quoting somebody from a book who's interviewed them or even hasn't interviewed them or just summarizes what information they presented. So I'm always a great believer in giving listeners and viewers an opportunity to go back and have a look at this thing for themselves.
Yeah, and another fellow who was involved apparently in the Nimitz case, was one of the pilots in the Nimitz case. He has kind of gone off the radar as well, but he left in kind of a different fashion. He was hired on by Bob Bigelow and signed a NDA with that organization and is not talking, but he's a fellow by the name of Douglas Kurth, and you've written a little bit about him as well.
Yes, it's amazing how many characters there are there. I couldn't believe the fact when I looked at the LinkedIn profile on the internet for Douglas Kurth, that in fact he was citing having worked for Robert Bigelow. And of course, a number of the research areas that we're interested in currently is all concerning the Nimitz 2004 incidents, Bob Bigelow's research, the DIA contract that Bigelow Advanced Aerospace Studies got for the DIA, and the information that came out of that. So I was just looking up, as a matter of fact, trying to find some details about Douglas Kurth. He was a Marine pilot, highly decorated, and on his LinkedIn page, he actually said that he went to work with Robert Bigelow in December 2007, which caused a bit of a red flag to me because the Nevada state records, which I checked for the creation or the registration of BAAS, BAS, they weren't actually registered until January 2008. So here was Douglas Kurth citing the fact that he was working for the organisation a month or two before. That's granted that Douglas Kurth's dates are correct on LinkedIn, but I found nothing to actually contradict that. And then on his LinkedIn page, I thought, well, what did he actually do for BAS? This will be interesting because we've never really known much about that, about what the people who were working for BAS were doing. And the LinkedIn entry said that he was the program, and I quote here, the program lead for novel and emerging space technologies targeting operational deployment in 2040. Directed and managed a team of 40 scientists, engineers, analysts, and researchers. And then he went on to the fact that he was also involved in business developing, and he was working on contracts for BAS. Now, that may not seem to mean much to your listeners, but the very fact that he was leading directing and managing a team of 40 scientists for Robert Bigelow, and it was dealing with emerging space technologies, that's exactly why BAS got the contract from the Defence Intelligence Agency, was exactly those areas to cover. So we have some confirmation that BAS people did get the contract from the Defence Intelligence Agency in 2008, and by early 2008 we're working on this. So here's another little confirmation from a person putting some details on their LinkedIn page to the solicitation or broad area announcement, which we know was about that program, which we know was led by Lukaski. So all these characters are interwoven. The question that then came to my mind, because I am a very inquisitive person, I thought, well, how come a Marine pilot who was involved in the Nimitz UFO incidences of November 2004, how come he went to work for Robert Bigelow on a program which was dealing with UFOs? Now, I haven't found a definitive answer, but that is a very interesting question. I can only imagine Bob Bigelow in 2007, when the Nimitz video was leaked to the internet, because we know now that although To the Stars Academy exposed the video back in December 2017, and the New York Times saw it, we know that actually the exact same video was leaked to the internet in 2007. Only 3 years.
It was leaked to a German CGI studio, I believe.
It
of all
was
places.
indeed, yeah. And what we now know is that that was the same video that was released in 2017, and that was reportedly from the Nimitz 2004. So we have a link there to the Nimitz 2004 incidents.
So just to jump in, I think it's really curious that that video would end up with a German CGI company. The Corey Good would get, of all people, would get leaked. A couple of Eric Davis's scientific papers that were for the program. Seems like somebody who does this leaking is got a little bit of a sense of humor there.
I agree totally. It is. I mean, if one goes back to the above top secret forums discussing the fact that this was leaked, first of all, the individuals on the forum were absolutely amazed and claimed it's got to be a hoax.
Right, exactly.
No one is going to leak a Navy Department video, infrared video of a UFO. They just aren't going to do it. And even individuals like researcher Isaac Coy in the UK at the time dismissed the whole thing as a probable hoax.
Sure. And Isaac, for folks who don't know, does a lot of great work at exposing these CGI videos that go viral. And a lot of times they are created by CGI houses legitimately for things like commercials that are shown overseas. So people in the States have never seen them, and they don't know. Yeah, they don't know that this was a commercial that was running in Brazil, for example. So some people think they're legitimate, and they go along with the hoax, and some folks dismiss them all. But here you go. The proof is in the pudding. It was a legit video, and the papers were legit too, regardless of who broke them.
Yes, well, with hindsight, we now know that that was a genuine video release by somebody who appeared to be a member of the crew of either the Nimitz or the USS Princeton, who were involved in those incidents. But also, I mean, talking about things coming back to bite you, ufologist Kurt Collins mentioned to me, he said, did you know that in a 2008 conference presentation, Richard Dolan missed the Nimitz incidents completely when he announced that he had a source that had come to him giving him details about this and this that had happened in 2004, and Richard Dolan just passed over it at the time. So there were a few people who might have got a lead into all of this 10 years before it emerged, but who knows? I mean, we only know now in hindsight that, in fact, Kevin Day, one of the witnesses from the USS Princeton, was in fact the person who had talked to Richard Dolan, but he talked to him anonymously. So Richard, quite rightly, wasn't able to verify the story, but Dolan did mention it in a 2008 conference presentation. Which again is
Robert Powell from SCU, he got a good beat on this story fairly early on, so that was a good thing. He didn't pass over it, but sometimes you do. You think you've come across something that's so wild, you dismiss it, but it turns out to be true. That's a mistake that happens. It happened with me once.
I think we've all been there. We've all kicked ourselves in a later stage. But so, yeah, just coming back to Douglas Kurth. So here we have one of the aviators involved in the USS Nimitz 2004 incidents, who turns up working for Bob Bigelow on a UFO program. Now, I only know of a couple of people who've approached Douglas Kurth over time. I'll mention Irish researcher and journalist Giuliano Marinkovic, who managed to track down a phone number for Kurth, rang him up and said that blah, 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 I'm interested to know your views on this. And Kurth essentially said something, and I'm quoting Giuliano here, quote, I did something, full stop. I can't talk about it, full stop. And that's all that Giuliano got out of Douglas Kurth. So he's another person that we would absolutely love to interview to find out what he was doing working with Robert Bigelow and Bass for several years.
And speaking of Bigelow, obviously he's put his money where his mouth is. He's not too big on sharing a lot of the information he gathers, but he's gathered plenty of it, some of it at the famous Skinwalker Ranch. But you also wrote a story about another piece of property that he purchased. So why don't you tell our folks about that?
Yeah, this is one of those things where you're reading a book and you just literally can't believe what you read. Again, Jacques Vallée's Diaries, Volume 4, released only this year. Lots and lots of interesting small facts in there, but I'm reading away. And then Jacques Vallée said, oh, and I went to Robert Bigelow's ranch, UFO ranch. And I thought, yeah, okay, Skinwalker Ranch. And then I read further and he said, we spent the day, I'll quote him here, we spent the day exploring the Mount Wilson Ranch. And I thought, what's that got to do with the UFOs, the Mount Wilson Ranch? So I read on further. And he said, yes, I spent the day at the Mount Wilson Ranch. I was along with a person called Dr. Tim Ryan of a scientific organization who was coming along to do some instrumentation. We were here at the bidding of Bob Bigelow, who bought a second UFO ranch. Now, this Mount Wilson Ranch, I'll just check, it's in Nevada, whereas Skinwalker Ranch is in Utah. And this was in August 1996. So this would be roughly the same time period that Bob Bigelow was buying the Skinwalker Ranch, 95, 96. I know we're going back 20 years here, but this is things that we literally, none of us ever knew. And what Vallée said about the place was that it was a typical Western, old movie stage set type of presentation. Bars, old buildings. He said you could have had a gunfight at the OK Corral at the particular ranch because it was that style. And what he found out by talking to an employee of Bigelow, who'd been hired by Bigelow to do UFO research in Nevada, a lady called Shelley Wadsworth, who pops up in a few places. But Bob Bigelow did confirm in one of his writings that he had employed Shelley Wadsworth to look at UFOs in Nevada for him. So she was close to the Mount Wilson Ranch in Nevada. And what we learned from, or what I learned and then shared with my blog readers about the ranch, according to Jacques Vallée's visit, was that UFOs had been seen as far back as 1993. There were stories of craft following cars at night, UFOs that shot intense beams into the sky, hovering black Delta craft, and strangely, tinfoil-like squares that folded onto themselves in the sky and then vanished. There were poltergeists recorded at the ranch. There was a ghost in one of the rooms there. And it seemed to have all the typical markings of what was going on at Skinwalker. And yet, until Jacques Vallée opened up about it in his diaries, until this year, I don't know that I'd never come across anyone else referring to a second ranch bought by Bob Bigelow. So we've got lots of people who are interested in Skinwalker. We've had a book written about Skinwalker. We've had documentary films popping up in the last year about the Skinwalker Ranch. But my question is why did Bob Bigelow buy another ranch? Now, we do have a partial answer. Jacques Vallée asked Bob Bigelow exactly that question. Why do you want to buy another ranch? Right. And Bigelow said to him, well, what we could do, Jacques Vallée, you're always talking about using controls. We could have two ranches, both of which have got UFO stories, poltergeist experiences, paranormal experiences. We could compare notes between the two. We can make one public and keep one private. And we could compare what happens at the two places. One where we're doing public research, Skywalker, I'm thinking of Star Wars there, Skinwalker.
Skinwalker, got it.
And we can have a private comparison ranch where the same sort of things are said to be going on, and we'll just keep all of this quiet. And I guess that's why we've never, to this day, heard of this second ranch. If you go onto the internet, you can go to the Mount Wilson Ranch now and stay there. It's open to the public. You can stay in room number 4 where the ghost inhabits, and if you're lucky, while you're there, you can see some UFOs. So it's now public property, as it were, privately owned, but available for you to go and stay there.
Do you know if Bigelow still owns it? Because I know he did sell Skinwalker Ranch, and apparently they're going to turn that place into a resort.
Jacques Vallée's diaries are silent on the question of what actually happened to that particular ranch. In fact, apart from Jacques Vallée's reference, I can't find a single other place on the internet which discusses any of this at all. Robert Bigelow owning it. So that's a story for, I think, our friend in Las Vegas, George Knapp, to follow up on. Oh, by the way, George Knapp did get asked about this. That was the last point I wanted to mention. Okay. Somebody went to George Knapp on Twitter this year, and following me mentioning it, somebody actually went to George Knapp and said, was the ranch used as a control? And I found a tweet from George Knapp on the 11th of March this year. Quote, "It was a positive control. Mount Wilson was purchased by Bigelow because it had a long history of both poltergeist and haunting witness reports and UFO sightings on the property and in the general area." And then he puts in brackets similar to Skinwalker, though not the same range of reported phenomena, close brackets. And then later in his tweet, George said, I must say, I never visited that particular ranch. So maybe we can get George to do a follow-up on that and tell us, or even
or maybe you can go back on Coast to Coast and interview him.
Well, but isn't it interesting how we have to wait 20 years for a book by an American ufologist who openly admits that his diaries only sell a few hundred copies, and somebody has to happen to read it in Australia and then happens to know that they'd never heard of the Mount Wilson Ranch for all this thing to become open. Yep. I mean, I'm amazed by the synchronicity sometimes that happen to us.
Well, I'm going to get into an Australian case, the Perth case that you've written about, but because obviously some things go on down under as well, and some great UFO cases down there. But let's stay on the North American track for now, and move over again, staying on the Bob Bigelow trail here. You had also written an article about some of the checks he's throwing around. Like I said, the guy definitely puts his money where his mouth is. And you wrote that he's written some pretty significant checks to various people. And why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, over the years, and again, we only know the details thanks to Chant Vallée's latest diaries, because Jack actually quotes monetary amounts. So, for example, there was, I think, $200,000 given to David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins to do the Roper survey, where they engaged a professional polling company to pose the question to the US community, trying to answer the question, how many Americans had been abducted by aliens? And that caused quite a furor when the results came out, because I think they were citing something like about 5% of the American population, according to this poll, had been abducted by somebody. So that was some money that was tossed around there. But Bigelow funded conferences. Actually, I must admit, for transparency, I was actually funded to go to a conference in 1992 on abductions that was held in a venue hired at MIT, where Bob Bigelow and the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, of all people, who had an interest in UFOs, put up the money to bring together about 100 of us from all over the globe to MIT, I think, for 6 days to talk about abductions. And that must have cost them a packet to do that.
Well, since you bring that up, if you don't mind jumping over to that a little bit, because sure. That was brought to my attention by James Yandoli, who has been co-host here at times and might be back again down the road, although he's got his own channel going these days. But he had asked me to ask you about that. So since you brought it up, why don't you talk in a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah,
about what went on there.
Yeah, so what we got was we got an invitation. Mine came by a phone call from the Fund for UFO Research that were helping manage the money. I forget who it was now. I don't know whether it was Bruce Maccabee or someone else. Said we'd like to invite you to a conference on abductions. We noticed you've been doing a bit of research in Australia, and I had been working with a number of psychologists, psychiatrists, and experiencers behind the scenes to try and uncover what was happening in this country to compare it to the US and other places. And I ended up at MIT. There was about 150 of us there, all the names you could name that had done abduction research. John Mack, Bud Hopkins, let's see, Robert Bigelow was apparently there, although I didn't know he was there. Someone told me later on that he'd attended. John Alexander was there giving a paper. I gave a couple of papers myself. It was a who's who list from all over the planets: South Africa, South America, Sweden, the US, Canada. And so what we did is we presented a whole host of scientific papers to the audience, and then we had discussions. We had panel sessions. We had panel sessions by experiencers. Some experiencers presented their particular work. Bud Hopkins gave a detailed presentation on the Linda case, famous abduction report from Manhattan, said to involve someone from the United Nations. We heard all of those firsthand. Richard Boylan was there. There was a number of psychologists who were studying the topic behind the scenes, who I met, but I won't quote because some of them never went on to become interested in the subject any further. But it was a real attempt at a scientific presentation of data about abduction cases. We talked implants, we talked photographs, we talked CAT scans. We looked at CAT scans. We talked to psychologists who had handled implants. We talked to UFO researchers who'd handled implants. So it was a great opportunity to mingle with a whole bunch of people who I otherwise wouldn't have met. And what came out of it was, a proceedings, which was about, I think, 600-700 pages long, which you can still buy a copy of on the net, called The Proceedings of that particular abduction conference. A journalist wrote a book about it, based on his 6 days at the conference, interviewing a whole range of us. And it was a very interesting time to be involved, because remember, this was in 1992, so we're almost 30 years back now. But it was the high time of abduction research. And this was where Bigelow, the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, and Rockefeller were all putting the big dollars into the topic. And coming back to what we were originally talking about, was the fact that, they were spending literally millions and millions of dollars to UFO researchers and individuals, both scientists and lay researchers, to look at this topic. I don't think there's ever been an era where so much money has been poured into research. Fascinating era to read about.
And also, obviously, some money's getting poured in today. Some of it is apparently going towards research into metamaterials, possible fragments from ET ships that have crashed, or pieces have fallen off, or something is going on in that department. And you have gone and are attempting to catalog various pieces that over a long period of time, some of this goes back to the Aurora case back in the late 1800s, and that has been brought up, and right up until today. TTSA, and also separately Gary Nolan and Jacques Vallée, have you already mentioned, they've got their own separate study going, and you're attempting to figure out which piece belongs to what claimed fragment, and what have you got on that so far?
Well, I was very surprised. I went to the internet and to my networks and said, where can I find a catalogue where somebody has brought together all the cases over the years where there have been fragments of UFOs reported, picked up, associated with sightings, and they've actually been analysed? Where can I read something about all of this? And time again, people came back from the US or from Sweden or from Canada or from other countries and said, no one's done the work. There isn't a single place where you can find all this stuff brought together. And I thought, well, am I going to have to spend some time doing this? And I thought, well, yes, if I want the answer to that question, what do we know about all of this stuff? Perhaps I've got to be the one to sit down and work at it. So over the last 6 months or so, in conjunction with a whole range of people like Chris Rakowski in Canada, Ted Phillips' old trace catalogue, which he did in the 1980s, 1990s, and a whole range of other people. Barry Greenwood dug into his archives in Boston for me. I was just looking down my list here. Yeah, guys in Sweden have helped, guys in Germany helped me with material, and very kindly Jacques Belay gave me some information for the catalogue. So what I've ended up is about 50 instances where over the years we have had pieces of UFO fragments come forward by individuals right back from 1897 to as recently as about 2 years ago. And I've been able to, by reading the UFO literature, tapping my networks overseas, digging out old publications from various archives, I've been able to compile a list together of places where these samples have turned up. And not only have they turned up, they've been analysed in some way. And I was surprised as a starting point to find out that there'd been at least 7 different pieces of material. So these are from 7 different individuals, 7 pieces of material said to have come from the Roswell crash, which is a remarkable number. And yes, every one of those 7 individuals have had their samples analysed. And unfortunately, the net result is more mystery than anything else. We've had laboratories in the US, we've had laboratories in various other countries have a look at this stuff. They publish their information. It's buried on the internet in various places, websites, old books, old magazines, and quite a lot of debate and discussion about it has come forward. What I then found is, going more into recent times, there was a big announcement in, I think it was about 10 years ago. Someone said, we have the definitive analysis of a piece of material from Roswell. I thought, well, this is great. Who actually analysed it? And I don't know whether you've ever heard of a fellow called Dr. Russell Vernon Clark, a chemist from Caltech. He held a conference which was widely carried globally, where he announced that he had done an analysis of the material from Roswell, that this material had been given to him. It had a history which could be tracked back to Roswell, and he was publicly announcing that as a scientist and chemist that he had found unusual isotopic ratios in the material, and he was willing to bet his career on the fact that this was extraterrestrial material. Well, you can't get much better than a chemist from a Californian top university going on a global conference and announcing that here we have ET material, and he had the analysis to prove it. Unfortunately, like a lot of the material I tracked down, it unraveled. It turned out that he wasn't a top scientist. He was an environmental health and safety specialist. He'd done the work in private, in his own time, at a university. And other scientists who looked at the results that he published on the internet said that they doubted his work, that there were probably, quote, huge mistakes in the original testing, unquote. They pointed out that one of the elements he was talking about that he had analysed was supposedly from a 1947 crash. However, that isotope was radioactive and had a short half-life of less than a day. So there was no way that it could have come from 1947. And what happened is that Dr. Vernon Clark just disappeared from the scene. His results were held, I guess, in up as a possible potential mistake. And in the 10 years since his conference, nothing else has ever come from any of those results. So that's the kind of material I was pulling together. I found 3 samples that had come from the Rendlesham Forest 1980 incident. And yeah, sure, they've been analysed as well. Results aren't fairly well known. They're just buried in the literature, old magazines, on the internet, in very odd websites. And so my attempt, which ended up was a 52-page document, which is available on the net at the Project 1947 website for anyone to go and read. The analysis is some really interesting instances. Most turn out to be mundane, but some of them just are crying out for peer review and another look at them. And I'm hoping that by publishing this material, that will get other people interested in doing a reanalysis of all this work, because buried amongst all of the trash are some treasures.
Yeah, I think that the work that Peter Sturrock did on the Ubatuba material is especially interesting. He's written that up. There's a link at my website over to that paper. Basically, the list of labs that studied this material, high-end labs, government, private sector, institutional, like colleges and whatnot, more than 24 in one way or another had looked at this material. Sturrock, at the end of his paper, concluded they couldn't figure out where it was manufactured. Very interesting case, that Ubatuba case. Apparently, based on Vallee's presentation at Contact in the Desert in late 2017, he and Nolan do have samples from that. I was wondering if TTSA have any of those samples. Yeah, I've never seen a photograph of this stuff, so I really have no idea. Do you know if TTSA has it? It seems like Nolan and Vallee absolutely do. They've got some samples from Sturrock.
Yes, Lou Elizondo, when he gave his talk in Rome, put up a slide where he showed photographs of some of the samples that they were analysing at TTSA, and none of them seemed to be the Ubatuba sample. Interestingly, I did find in an old magazine that one of my correspondents sent me some photographs of the Ubatuba sample, which I'd never seen before, old black and white photographs. But what's probably more interesting is that when Jacques Vallée was, I think, down in South America a couple of years ago, he went to a museum, and there he found a couple of samples from Ubatuba that he wasn't aware existed. And he kindly was given a portion of those samples to take back to the US. And he has, in fact, analysed them. And at the Contact in the Desert presentation, Vallée did show some of the results from those samples that he brought back recently. And he said that those samples definitely had some unusual isotopic ratios, which is what we're trying to find, some material that hasn't been made on the Earth. But that he thought that the fact was that he needed to do some rechecking, and that he wasn't ready to publish much about the Ubatuba recently acquired samples. So that's a very interesting, promising line of research.
Yeah, and as best as I recall from the Sturrock paper, there was not any unusual isotopic ratios in the samples that he had checked, at least as far as he was concerned. Yes, that's correct,
yes. So what's interesting now is if we have the chain of evidence showing that the sample which was in this museum did come from Ubatuba, and Vallée seems to think that it did because of what he found out and what he was told, but when he spoke to the people who ran the museum, he was quite keen to get the sample tested. So then if that chain of evidence or chain of circumstances does lead back to Ubatuba in 57, then we do have some unusual isotopic ratios associated with that particular sample. But what's probably the best thing that I came across was I asked Jacques Vallée in an email recently, I said, well, what have you done recently that you can talk about? What are you doing? I was hoping to bring out some work that he and Gary Nolan were doing. And he said, well, no, we're not ready to publish yet. But I then found a quote on a YouTube video. Where
what was the time frame for that correspondence, if you don't mind my jumping in here, Keith?
About 2 months ago.
Okay.
Yeah, Vallée very kindly, I posted a copy of my catalogue, and he very kindly wrote back and said, you know, it's great that somebody's assembled such a catalogue. This will be very useful to us, which I took as a nice compliment. And then I went back to him cheekily and said, well, what can you tell me about more recent things? And he said, well, we can't, we're still working on it. But then somebody pointed me to a 2017 September YouTube interview with Vallée, which appeared on a podcast called Grimerica. So this was a YouTube video I could watch myself. And Vallée, in his own words, quote, for example, there is an element that has 5 isotopes in different abundance. In the sample we have, 2 of the isotopes are not present, and the other 3 are present at 33%, 33%, 33%. That can only happen if somebody has separated the isotopes and reintroduced them into an alloy for some reason we can't fathom. But I'm not ready to publish yet. We need to redo the analysis. So this is Valet in September 2017 talking about yet another sample with extremely odd isotopic ratios. In fact,
if I remember, I think that was the Sierra sample.
He doesn't actually, in the bit that I saw on YouTube that I took my quote from, he doesn't actually say that it was the Sierra one. I did find his Sierra analysis from Contact in the Desert, and it's certainly the work that he published and showed as a slide at that conference at Contact in the Desert didn't have anything like these really bizarre, odd isotopic ratios. So I'm not certain that it is Sierra.
Okay. And there was... sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to finish off by saying, but it is nice to know that people of the quality of Jacques Vallée and Gary Nolan are working on this at the present moment.
Yeah, now there was an additional sample that was mentioned in the Vallée presentation with the NIDS. And obviously we know that's Bigelow's organization, the National Institute of Discovery Science, or at least I'm close there on that. And they didn't have a sample available. Do we know how far have you gotten in terms of identifying the specific piece with the picture on Elizondo's slide presentation? One jumps out, one sort of front and center you've got, or they've got, is the arts parts piece, the piece with the bismuth that Hal Puthoff has talked about quite a bit. There's another piece that looks like a Rendlesham sample. It's labeled as such. And there's another piece that goes back a ways, a Bob White sample. And have you been able to attach known samples with these photographs?
No, I actually have challenged a number of my colleagues overseas and posted a very high definition photograph of Lou Elizondo's slide, which is really clear. And if we were... I expected somebody somewhere to be able to say, that was the Russian sample from 2010, but no one has. So I've scratched the brains of quite a lot of people and come up with about 5 of those images, which are TTSA samples that they've got that are completely unknown to the UFO community. So I can only surmise that individuals who've been keeping these samples for a while heard the call from TTSA for samples and simply said, well, I've got something for you to look at. Well, of course, Lou said that most of those samples are mundane, but there are some interesting ones there. But he wasn't willing to point out which of the images corresponded to the interesting material.
Okay, now the ones that we do know about. Now, the arts parts is the one that's sort of bottom center, shaped a bit like an icicle. I believe the one that's sort of on the top in the center, but to the left of the round object, that is a Rendlesham sample, I believe. Let's see. I think that the one that sort of looks like a baseball bat to the far right in the center, I think that's the Bob White piece. Not sure about all that. So can you tell the folks at least what we're a little bit sure of?
Well, what the catalogue has revealed is that some of these pieces that are imaged on the TTSA slide have actually, in fact, undergone quite a few previous analyses. So with the Bob White piece of material from about 1985-87 in the US, that has a lot of people who've analysed it who said that it's unknown. There are pieces on YouTube saying it's unknown. Documentaries that have appeared on the History Channel or the National Geographic Channel have said it's odd and unknown. Only one group of people have come forward and said, we know what that was. And a skeptics group in the US said that all it was a piece of accumulated material, which is part of an industrial process They explained the industrial process in a journal article. They showed photographs of similar castings which they had found, which had come out of these particular processes. And to me, as a layperson, they do look almost identical to that particular piece of material. So I think some of these things have a long history of having claims to be anomalous, but may not be. And it's the same with its parts. Back in, I think it was about 1997, the bismuth sample, which was handed over to Hal Puthoff in the early 2000s, was given by Linda Moulton Howe to several universities to analyse. And one of the analyses said, I think this piece of material was manufactured on Earth. I think it was manufactured in America. I think it was part of this stealth US Air Force program. I'm pretty certain from my analysis that it's earthly technology. Very unusual, but earthly. And that particular analysis rarely is quoted by anybody. You'll see most of the quotes on the internet are from the analysis which raise the possibility of the material being extraterrestrial. So what I've been attempting to do is look at the pros and cons for some of these analyses so that we can have a debate. And hopefully people will reanalyze, like now the TTSA is reanalyzing Arts Parts materials. So I'm looking forward to their results. I'm hoping that we're going to get a peer-reviewed science paper out of it. But my pessimistic side says the results are going to be announced to us on a History Channel documentary in May, and we won't get the hard science paper that I would love to see with these analyses. But we'll wait and see. That's not coming up for a few weeks yet.
One piece that you did cover in your gigantic, basically encyclopedia, your PDF encyclopedia of all these pieces that have been mentioned over the years, is one that relates to the DC-52 case. I think this is really fascinating because I'm a big buff on this case in general, but was not aware of this particular claim coming from Wilbert Smith, that they found a sample as a result of the DC-52 case that had, let me see here, matrix of great numbers, thousands of 15-micron spheres scattered throughout it, a piece of metal about twice the size of your thumb. And this apparently came out. Nick Redfern has written about it. And we've only got the source, Wilbert Smith, who happens to be the same fellow that Grant Cameron often cites as being the guy who has said out of Canada that keeping the extraterrestrial secret under wraps is the most highly classified thing going in the United States. So I'm assuming we'll never see a sample of that. That'll never get into any kind of public hands. But have you found out anything interesting about that beyond what I've already mentioned?
Yeah, well, I've actually found out some information which tends to relegate that to more of a mythology than anything else.
Okay.
What I found is that I've been corresponding with a person in the US who doesn't want me to mention his name, but he's one of the top ufologists, probably our best analyst in the field, goes back years and years and years, and he actually studied this case, which I was unaware of until I mentioned it to him and he saw my catalogue. And what he says is that the details that Frank Edwards wrote up and the details that were cited by Wilbur Smith are in fact a very distorted version of the fall of a stone from the sky near a place called Hendon, Virginia, found by a family called the Lanham family. The object wasn't metal, more resembled concrete, and was handed over to the US Air Force. But he said, I've interviewed the person who looked at all of that, and he tells me that Smith's comments about, quote, a matrix of magnesium orthosilicate composed of particles of 15 microns, unquote, actually fits the description of a rare magnesium enstatite chondrite meteorite. And so there's some doubt now in my mind as to the value of or the genuineness of the original story that we've got from those two sources. I'm trying to get my correspondent to go public with the information that he has. But I've known him for years and years and years, and I really value his work. And that seems to me the possibility of it actually being a meteorite. Now, who knows? I can only quote what I'm being told at the present moment.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical myself of the story, but it does relate to the DC-52 case, and obviously I'm very curious. So keep us updated on how all that pans out. And so we've gotten through all that, and let's go. Obviously, you spend so much time researching UFOs here in the States. It's like you would think that nothing ever happens in Australia, but that's not the case.
Well, we have a couple of famous cases that I guess probably just about everyone's heard of. The disappearing pilot, Frederick Valentich, who was flying a plane over the Southern Ocean out of Melbourne in the state of Victoria, who in 1978, one night, flying alone, radioed air traffic controller that he was being buzzed by a green UFO. And that pilot and plane disappeared, never to be seen again. So that's one of our most, I guess, famous cases that have went globally. Was investigated by a whole range of people at the time. Richard Haynes, famous US ufologist, wrote a book about it called The Melbourne Episode. Lots of debate about what exactly happened. Story disappeared after a while because no one knew what had happened until I went searching in our Australian government archives about 10 years ago. And like I do a lot of times, I'm just playing around with keywords. So I just thought, just on a whim, I'll type in Frederick Valentich. And lo and behold, I found that the Australian government had just made available 1,000 pages of its own research into that particular mysterious disappearance. Now, that was something no one had ever seen before, so I ordered a copy of it, kept it to myself, sat down and read the entire file. And here was our government aircraft crash investigators doing a detailed investigation of what had happened. A wealth of material in those 1,000 pages. I wrote quite a lot of items about it. It ended up overseas. A lot of people read the actual files themselves because I got them digitized by the Australian government. And that's one of our classic cases, I guess, which remains a mystery to this day.
And now that's how you've got it? You've got it as a mystery?
Yes. You read the 1,000 pages and you scratch your head at the end of it. You think, well, the government accident investigation people who are extremely thorough, who will find the fact that a small bird flew into the intake of a jet and caused a crash, have a look at this particular set of data. They don't have an aircraft. They don't have a body. They merely can interview everyone associated with it, the air traffic controller. The plane wasn't on radar at the time. The weather was calm. It just disappeared in the middle of nowhere. Shouldn't have been possible, but was. And so they did all they could short of having an aircraft, crashed aircraft parts and a pilot or a body. But they were baffled. In the end, the conclusion from the government investigation was, we don't know.
I have a question from a listener. Keith, I don't know if you can hear me, but yes. One of our listeners who wishes to remain anonymous, he's a loyal listener, and he really appreciates and respects your work. He said he wants to know, did you investigate the Westall UFO case? Like the Ariel School, this was also school children sighting, also a school children sighting from 1966. Again, it was the Westall UFO case. Did you investigate that?
A number of us here in Australia investigated it. Just for listeners, as a bit of perspective, back in April 1966 at a school in outer Melbourne, so it was an outer suburb of one of our capital cities, a group of school children were out on the school oval and they saw a mysterious oval object approach them, pass over the school and appear to land in an adjacent set of fields. A number of them went to the spot. A number of them report seeing one object then take off. A school teacher at the school verifies that he saw an object in the sky. And the story was investigated by the local UFO Research Society, but apparently the headmaster at the school called an assembly of the school children and advised them not to talk about it. And so the story from 1966 sat very quietly until it re-emerged only in about 2006, when a Canberra researcher named Shane Ryan decided to try and gather all the pieces of evidence that he could about the particular case. And ultimately, Shane brought together about 200 witnesses from the school. He tracked down a number of teachers, interviewed them. He found old papers, as I did, from James MacDonald. James MacDonald came to Australia. The famous physicist researcher came to Australia in the mid-60s, interviewed the teacher, collected some of the evidence about the sightings. So we're talking about a visual sighting where there are claims of a physical trace being found. And I say a claim because the local UFO group at the time wasn't able to document it because they couldn't get access to a lot of the school children and teachers. So we have a very interesting mass observation in 1966, which then popped up 50 years later. And a number of us went around, we interviewed people, we tracked down old data, we tracked weather data from the time, we tracked astronomical data. We got all the original material we could find, newspaper clippings, interviewed, the teacher was re-interviewed. He was still living and still is living. About a dozen to 15 of the students were re-interviewed by a whole range of researchers. And no one has been able to find any information in terms of documents in Australian government archives about it. I've spent a lot of time trying to find documentation by the government. The government is supposed to have investigated it. There are anecdotal accounts from people who say, I went to investigate it on behalf of blah, 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 but we haven't found any documents. So it's one of these cases which is tantalizing, visual observation, possible physical trace case, resurfaces 50 years later. We have all the problems of people, are they remembering correctly what happened, misremembering? We don't have any diary entries from the time. We don't have any original documentation from the time where somebody wrote an account of what happened, apart from one local UFO group report form. So to me, having looked at that, again, it is one of our classic mysterious cases to try and explain.
Okay, Keith, I actually had a question for you. Sorry to interrupt, Frank, but Keith, I had the pleasure and privilege of interviewing John Dover. You probably know who he is. He's a retired Navajo Ranger. He was a part of a group of federal law enforcement officers here in the United States that police Navajo reservations, along with his partner Stan Milford. John Dover has taken paranormal reports and UFO reports and also done investigations on them for 11 years. When I interviewed him during the Phoenix Lights movie, he said this, and then I was going to ask you a question. Whenever he conducted investigations, which were during an 11-year stint into the paranormal and UFO incidents on Navajo reservations, when he and his partner had major cases to investigate, he said there was always a government presence other than their own staff on site to investigate major cases they had. They would get over flights of yellow H, CH-53s, no markings on these black helicopters that were, there were also special ops people, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Green Berets, Secret Service, elite types showing up over time regarding their major investigations into the paranormal and UFOs and what they believe were extraterrestrial crafts. Dover took pictures of these guys. My question to you, Keith, is do you hear about this kind of situation taking place during your research of the topics you cover, meaning these elite types showing up and black helicopters and unmarked helicopters hovering over areas of interest regarding UFOs or extraterrestrial craft?
Based on my own research here in Australia, in which I've attempted to track down some of the individuals who have done the official government investigations, and I must stress the official government investigations, we don't know what else may have occurred. I've never found any instances where of similar nature to what you're describing. I made an effort one time through the government archives to track down the Royal Australian Air Force's top scientist who worked for our defence intelligence people, who was the consultant for the Air Force here, who investigated UFOs in Australia from the early 50s until about the mid-90s. And he was in his 80s at the time, very lucid, and he was able to tell me the background right from the 1950s of his involvement with the Australian government. And he told me, in contact with people in the US intelligence agencies. He compared notes to what was going on in the US to what was going here. He also compared notes with intelligence agencies in the UK. And he was baffled by why these things tended to happen overseas, particularly in the US, and not here in Australia. He told me that he'd never found any evidence of a covert program that he was able to access. And in all my contacts with whistleblowers, officials who talk to me behind the scenes, I've not found any parallels to it in the US. It's a bit like accounts of military involvement with abductions. My labs, Helmut, his name just Kellner or something like that, who started the research into my labs. He was an Austrian scientist in the 90s, approached me and said, do you have anything similar happening here in Australia? I said, no, look, I have a network, Australia-wide network of health professionals and experiences, about 100 strong, who I'm talking to about all of these things. We just haven't had anything like that occurring here in Australia. So it seems to us that part of the phenomena is US-centric rather than global, and I have no explanation for that.
Well,
okay,
one
and
thing.
then
Go ahead.
I just have one last question, Frank. Keith, I have a philosophical question for you. Dr. Anna Freud, I think she was a daughter of Freud, Sigmund Freud. She said you have to have a great love of the truth, scientific truth, as well as personal truth. And you have to place this appreciation of truth higher than any discomfort at meeting unpleasant facts, whether they belong to the outside world, whether they belong to the world outside or to your inner person. Do you agree with that?
I do indeed, yes. I mean, I've sat in paddocks, what we call fields in Australia, paddocks, talking to farmers who've had mental communications to move out of a building, a barn, and go and watch something in the sky. I've spoken to a whole range of people who've experienced some extraordinary things, which I never have, but whose personal veracity and credibility, I would say, rate is extremely high, in my opinion. I've sat with people and they've told me some extraordinary things, and just because I haven't experienced them gives me no reason to doubt that they have. And I would certainly agree with that statement that we need not to dismiss any piece of information that we come across unless we can verify that it is not accurate or ineffectual, or somebody's trying to hoax us, or it's a piece of disinformation. But I'd certainly, in my research, honour looking back at original material, finding and talking to individuals themselves who've had the experiences rather than relying on second or third hand documentation. So, yes, I think we have to really value the individuals who are having these experiences and learn from what they're able to describe to us. I think a famous statement by John Alexander, who said he thought that the phenomena was possibly unknowable, is very, very accurate. And Jacques Vallée's mentioned the same sort of thing. Is it possible for us to ever know and fully understand what the phenomena's about? because once we come up with one idea of what we think it is, then suddenly 12 other pieces of data point somewhere else. And I know Lou Elizondo has also ascribed to the same viewpoint, that we shouldn't be saying just because some of the evidence points to the phenomena being extraterrestrial, that it is extraterrestrial. He is asking us to retain an open mind on both paranormal and UFO experiences. So yes, I think the quote you read is extremely accurate, and I would agree with it.
Yeah,
Okay,
I think
great.
what we're
Thank you.
involved in with all this is we are in a process of discovering new questions. I think that is a quote that I saw in a science article recently, and I think it applies very, very well here. That's what we're doing, discovering new questions. So, and I've got a question for you, Keith, about a case you've taken a closer look at and written up at your blog. A specific type of case that I happen to think very, very highly of, and that is radar cases where there is witness backup. They corroborate each other. I think they're fascinating. I consider radar to be physical evidence of UFOs. And there was a case in Australia near Perth that you've taken a closer look at in December of 1980, and you've written that up. And why don't you tell the folks a little bit about that?
Yes, this is an instance of a case which I knew very little about. Back in 1980, so we're going back,
40 years now, almost
40 years now. I did come across on an Air Force file a telex referring to a radar visual case in Perth, which is a capital city of one of our states here on the western coast of Australia. And it simply was tantalising, saying that air traffic control had picked up 4 objects tracking across Perth during the daytime, and there'd been some visual sightings. And that was never ever followed up on the Air Force file. And I just never had an opportunity to see anything or read anything more about it. Recently, an old friend of mine passed away, and in his papers buried in his garage, I found he had some documentation about this. In fact, somebody had interviewed some of the visual witnesses. The air traffic controller's own diaries had been photocopied and placed in these documents. And it was an instance which we get all over the world where some strange objects were picked up on radar. Air traffic controllers themselves made some visual sightings of these things. And they saw the classic silver tumbling discs popping across based on radar. They were seen at a height of about 8,000 meters. They went up to 20,000 meters and then they were lost to sight. There was nothing in the area that could explain it. The Air Force were baffled.
Just for the folks not familiar with the metric system, when you say 8,000 meters, is that 72,000 feet?
8,000 meters is about it's about 3 feet to a meter, so that'd be about 24,000 feet.
Okay, because I do see a mention here where at later altitude now 72,000 feet. That's much higher than any kind of commercial aircraft is going to be flying at.
That's right, yes. So what was interesting is actually finding a copy of the air traffic control, what they call their daily journal, which recorded all these sightings that were coming visually. It recorded all the radar detail. Because it's so far in the past, in recent examples of cases here in Australia, we've used the freedom of information to actually get the radar data out of air traffic control people who have been very, very open with us. I've spoken to a number of them. I can put in an FOI request and say I'd like the radar from this airport, this date, this time to this time, and within a few days I get a DVD with all of the radar detail on it. Going back to 1980, those sort of records don't exist. So I'd love a case like this to happen today, or in fact in recent times. And strange to say, another one did. My colleague in Melbourne, Paul Dean, and I, in 2014, so we're going back almost 5 years, but fairly recent, there was an incident where a passenger aircraft was flying into Perth Airport, and the pilot and co-pilot who we interviewed said they had seen what looked like a green cylindrical object approaching the aircraft. They got on touch with air traffic control and asked if they could maneuver because the object was going to crash with them. The air traffic controllers say, we've got nothing on radar, you don't have permission to manoeuvre. And the pilot, in typical Australian language, said a four-letter word and said, "Blow you, I am going to manoeuvre the aircraft." So he manoeuvred around this object which went past him at very close range, possibly within 50 feet of the aircraft, and the object just kept going up into the sky. The pilot and co-pilot landed, a bit shaken, reported it officially, which a lot of pilots refused to do so. They were interviewed by air traffic control. We managed to interview the pilot, the co-pilot. We got the radar data. We have a radar expert who analysed it for us. Nothing was visible on the radar, either on transponder radar or on raw radar. There was nothing in the area at the time. We could see the aircraft on the radar tapes. We saw the aircraft make a small deviation that the radar picked up at the time that he claimed to air traffic control that this object went past him. Now, you don't deviate a passenger aircraft for nothing. He swore to us when we interviewed him by phone, that the object it was 5 units long by 1 unit wide. It was green in colour. It had
what do you mean by a unit, Keith?
He was unable to say the actual size of the object was 200 feet long. What we said to him, what was the ratio of the length to the width?
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay,
he said
okay.
The length was 5 times the width. So if it was 10 feet across, it was 50 feet long.
And that's because he couldn't exactly come up with a distance for you?
He didn't know the distance, therefore he couldn't estimate. So he was good. He just went on the ratio.
It was close enough to avoid, though.
Well, there was no wash from it. It was close enough that he had to manoeuvre his aircraft to avoid a collision. So what happened then is the aircraft accident investigation people, our official government body, interviewed the pilot, the air traffic controller, and for the first time ever published a report that stated that an unknown object, they didn't use the word a UFO, they said an unknown object had almost collided with a passenger plane in broad daylight. And so what Paul and I did is we interviewed the guy who wrote the report. And he said, officially, I can't tell you anything. He said, unofficially, he said, we are baffled. We have no clues what it was. He said you could think perhaps it was an unmanned aerial vehicle. But he says you don't have UAVs that are missile-shaped with no fins, no wings, no nose, no control surfaces, just a 5-to-1 ratio cylinder. I hate to call it a tic-tac because no one described it as a tic-tac, but it was a similar sort of shape.
Right.
And the official government document, which they put on their website for accident investigations, said, we just don't know. Unknown object nearly collided with the passenger aircraft. So that's the closest radar visual thing we've had in the last 5 years here.
Got it.
I wanted to make a comment to you, Keith, and then see if you have any comments back. Not really a question, just a comment. So I'm going to talk for a moment. Earth's broadcast signals have reached every star within about 80 light years as of 2016. So this data needs to be updated a little bit. From the sun, about 8,531 stars and 3,555 Earth-like planets. That is a very tiny fraction of what it is out there. Furthermore, it would take the same amount of time for aliens to answer. Moving on, there could well be alien civilizations that do not transmit strong enough signals to be detected. Alien civilizations might have died long ago, and any radio waves they may have used, might have long passed Earth. And the time it takes for radio signals to broadcast throughout the universe is much larger than the time we have spent listening for responses. That's kind of a smattering of information, all alien related, about broadcast signals throughout the universe, whether past or present. But I wanted to kind of see if you have any comments about aliens broadcasting signals and being detected long after they're dead.
That's a very interesting concept. And because with recent scientific findings, we have found so many exoplanets now in their thousands orbiting stars with a whole range of distances from Earth. The likelihood of there being life elsewhere in the universe has increased highly in probability. The possibility of intelligent life in the universe, I think, has increased slightly. And the possibility that someone is visiting us has increased, I think, with the knowledge that we have. But it's one of those questions that Frank said, we're still finding the questions to ask rather than finding the answers to those questions. But it's a really interesting observation that you commented there.
Well, Keith, I sure do appreciate you coming on with us. You spent a good solid 2 hours, and I think we're jam-packed with fantastic information. Sure do appreciate it. Stay in touch, and obviously keep an eye on Keith's blog spot. It is, let's see, scientific research. Hang on a sec here. UFO-scientificresearch.blogspot.com. I think if you just Google Keith Basterfield and UFOs, you'll turn up that blog spot pretty quick. That might be the easiest way to find it. But we've got a link to it in our description section. And Keith, I sure do appreciate you coming on. And keep up the good work. We'll be keeping our eyes on your latest missives.
And Keith, I would like to also thank you, and I also want to reassure you, I have shared your link amply throughout the chat discussion to the right of the interview, and it's just been such an honor to interview you. You have you are so well respected in the UFO community, and there's a reason for that. So we all want to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Chant. What I do appreciate is an opportunity to network with people. Not a single one of us is going to solve the answer to the phenomenon alone. We do need the networks that we're creating and the discussions that we have and bits and pieces of data that we can find from wherever. So I appreciate the opportunity to network with people as well.
Thanks so much again, Keith, and good night, everybody. Thanks for staying up late on the East Coast in the U.S., and maybe some folks in Europe are listening over breakfast. So you have a good night, and Keith, enjoy the rest of your day. What is it, about 3 in the afternoon now there now?
2:07 p.m. in the afternoon.
2:07.
Time for my afternoon coffee.
Enjoy, Keith. Thanks again, and good night, everybody.